In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro covers a broad array of pressing topics, ranging from the violent crackdown on protesters in Iran to the controversies surrounding ICE enforcement in the United States. He also delves into the political dynamics influencing the Federal Reserve and an investigation into Jerome Powell, while highlighting the launch of a new show focused on Christian apologetics and biblical discussions. Throughout, Shapiro critiques Hollywood's priorities, U.S. political responses to international crises, and the domestic political climate in America. Ben Shapiro begins by condemning the brutal suppression of Iranian protesters, with hundreds reportedly killed by the Revolutionary Guard in one of the most significant uprisings since 1979. Eyewitnesses and rights groups document a severe human rights crisis that the global media is covering only partially. Despite the severity of these events, Shapiro criticizes Hollywood's focus during the Golden Globes, where celebrities chose to highlight issues such as ICE enforcement and LGBTQ+ rights, but largely ignored the Iranian protests. He calls Hollywood's priorities skewed, pointing out how it consistently neglects situations where authoritarian regimes violently suppress dissent while focusing on domestic culture wars instead. The shooting of Renee, who was killed during an ICE enforcement operation in Minneapolis, serves as a flashpoint in Shapiro's discussion of law enforcement and public protest. He closely analyzes video footage that shows Good obstructing ICE agents with her vehicle and taunting the officers before attempting to drive away, an action that led to the fatal shooting. Shapiro argues that her shooting, while tragic, occurred within a context of federal law enforcement performing their duty under hostile conditions. He contrasts this with the widespread left-wing narrative that paints ICE solely as a brutal, oppressive force, noting how that narrative fuels further anti-ICE demonstrations. These protests, often violent and ill-informed, equate ICE agents with Nazi stormtroopers, a comparison Shapiro vigorously disputes as unconscionable and inaccurate. He also highlights congressional Democrats who exploit this incident to push anti-ICE rhetoric and calls for reform, suggesting that such political posturing inflames tensions without enhancing public safety. Shapiro explains how the shooting intensified national debates over immigration enforcement, with some progressive politicians branding ICE as inhumane and illegitimate within urban areas. He spotlights key figures like Senator Chris Murphy and Representatives Ayanna Pressley and Ilhan Omar, who criticize ICE's actions and advocate for sweeping changes or abolition. Shapiro counters their stance by emphasizing the necessity of enforcing immigration laws, especially against criminal illegal immigrants. The escalation of protests armed with organized training and tactics to obstruct law enforcement invigorates confrontations that Shapiro predicts will lead to further tragic outcomes. Domestically, Shapiro addresses the ongoing fraud scandals linked to big government programs in Minnesota and New York. He critiques Democratic politicians who, despite high-profile cases of program misuse and corruption, continue defending implicated officials rather than pursuing accountability. The Minnesota paid family leave fraud scandal and New York Affordable Housing Code violations illuminate systemic failures and political complacency in combating corruption. Shapiro argues that such tolerance of fraud fundamentally undermines the purpose of social welfare programs and benefits entrenched political machines more than the citizens they claim to serve. Shapiro then shifts focus to developments within the Federal Reserve, discussing a newly revealed criminal investigation into Fed Chair Jerome Powell. The inquiry, authorized by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., regards alleged inaccuracies in Powell's congressional testimony about a costly Federal Reserve building renovation project. While Shapiro questions the merits of the investigation and warns against politicizing the Justice Department, he acknowledges the broader tension between Powell and President Trump, who has vocally criticized Powell's resistance to cutting interest rates. Powell's response emphasizes his commitment to independent Federal Reserve policy over political pressures, warning against undermining market stability. Shapiro critiques Trump's interventionist approach to Fed policy, suggesting it risks economic uncertainty. Returning to the Middle East, Shapiro outlines how the Trump administration is deliberating on responses to the Iranian crackdown. With the regime severely weakened after recent conflicts and internal unrest, U.S. officials are considering military options, ranging from targeted strikes on Revolutionary Guard facilities to seizing Iranian oil tankers, thereby crippling the regime's financial ability to suppress dissent. Shapiro stresses that no large-scale American occupation is being contemplated. Instead, precision actions aim to support Iranian protesters and weaken the mullah's grip. He highlights the strategic implications of Iranian alliances with Russia and China and underlines the potential shift in regional geopolitical dynamics if the regime falls. Unlike the robust rhetorical and activist response to ICE and related issues, Shapiro notes a conspicuous absence of mass protests or vocal advocacy from democratic leaders and left-wing groups regarding the Iranian protests. Despite the thousands of lives lost and widespread suppression, there has been little substantive call for material or diplomatic support from the traditional human rights advocates within the U.S. political left. Shapiro frames this as hypocritical, contrasting it with past selective activism and accusing them of ignoring crucial human rights abuses when inconvenient to their political agendas. Throughout the episode, Shapiro repeatedly criticizes Hollywood's engagement with cultural issues, depicting it as self-absorbed and out of touch with global crises. He mocks the theatrical nature of Golden Globes activism, singling out comedian Nikki Glaser and actor Mark Ruffalo for their performative outrage over ICE and domestic controversies, while failing to acknowledge or support courageous Iranians risking their lives. This critique exemplifies Shapiro's broader argument about the misplacement of moral priorities among influential cultural figures. In a more uplifting portion of the podcast, Shapiro announces the addition of Matt Fradd and his show Pints with Aquinas to the Daily Wire Plus platform. The program is praised for its intellectual and thoughtful approach to Christian apologetics and biblical theology, offering long-form discussions that challenge secular assumptions about faith. Shapiro and Fradd discuss the renewed interest in traditional religious practices among younger Americans, spanning increased Orthodox adherence across religious communities, and the importance of faith as a bulwark against cultural decay. Shapiro briefly covers President Trump's expressed willingness to collaborate with Elon Musk to potentially activate Starlink satellite internet services over Iran, aiming to circumvent government-imposed communication blackouts. This technical assistance could support protesters by enhancing their ability to share information and organize despite regime censorship, aligning with the administration's broader approach of aiding Iranian dissent while avoiding direct military intervention. Finally, Shapiro returns to domestic issues by highlighting the ongoing national protests against ICE, fueled in part by activist groups organizing training sessions to obstruct immigration enforcement operations. He warns that these confrontations are likely to intensify, increasing risks for both law enforcement and civilians. Shapiro underscores the importance of measured law enforcement responses and cautions against the politicization and exaggeration of such incidents, advocating for factual clarity and responsibility in public discourse. Shapiro critiques the rhetoric of several Democratic politicians who label President Trump a dictator and condemn ICE, suggesting that such inflammatory language exacerbates division and escalates conflict unnecessarily. He also addresses the misstatements from figures like Ilhan Omar about ICE's jurisdiction, reaffirming that ICE operates lawfully within its mandate to enforce immigration laws. Conversely, he acknowledges more measured voices such as Tom Homan, who frame ICE's role as targeting dangerous criminals and maintaining public safety.